I'm going to we are going to record our conversation tonight. So let's kick it off by having each of you just give us a maybe 2 to 3 minute introduction. So Sierra, can I call on you to go first?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending this little follow-up session that we have here. So as Kate mentioned, I'm the Senior Forestry Manager for American Forest Foundation. So what I do is I work mostly in the enrollment process with landowners and with foresters. So if you have a forester, usually I connect with them to get your initial planning information to determine eligibility. And then I also work with landowners that do not have a forester in assigning them a forester.
Great, thanks, Sierra. Let's go. So I'll go up on my gallery here. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself next? Tim, I think you're still on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
I should know that by now. My name is Tim Stout. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah, great.
And I have spent my 35 years working for large utilities around the country on energy efficiency and renewable energy. I left that about 5 years ago and decided I'd dedicate my next chapter of my life to, believe it or not, looking at how to integrate forest carbon sequestration and storage in the land management plans that we have here in Vermont. So one of the first people I actually reached out to was Jim Shallow. Many of Keith's staff, and I have spent the last 3 years very closely integrated with the Family Forest Carbon Program. I've looked at about 4 different programs, forest carbon programs in detail, and have decided or chose the Family Forest Carbon Program for reasons I'll explain further. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Tim. All right, Keith, how about your turn?
Hi, all. I'm Keith Thompson. I'm the Private Lands Program Manager with the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. My work, I coordinate the work of the county foresters, the administration of the current use program, and the work that the department does to support stewardship of privately owned forest land throughout the state. Worked as a consulting forester in the state and a county forester in Chittenden County for a stint before coming to this position about, I guess we're 8 years ago now. Thanks.
Thanks, Keith. All right, and then finally, Jim, if you'll introduce yourself.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jim Shallow. I'm the Conservation Director at the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And if you don't, the Nature Conservancy is a global conservation organization. We're active around the globe and in all the states in the United States. And here in Vermont, we've been working for over 60 years to help protect these special places. We own about 30,000 acres in the state. We have those lands enrolled in the current use program. And we also worked with a number of landowners to protect their land as well. Really excited about this program because it's a great intersection of opportunity for us to address both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis that's facing the globe. And that's why we're really excited about this, because it's providing an opportunity for landowners like yourself to participate in solutions and at the same time find ways to manage your lands and get the resources in hand to do great practices to advance your objectives as landowners as well. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation and the questions that you throw at us. So I'm gonna sit back and let the magic happen.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jim. And you guys all are the magic, everybody who's tuned in tonight. So as Jim mentioned, please, go ahead and use that chat box to send in questions. We have, I think a really exciting and a great panel lined up tonight. And, I'm hoping that we'll be able to cover a lot of ground. I just, as we start off, I want to give you just a quick overview of what you can expect. So as we get underway here, so we have a couple of sort of the frame of tonight is that we'll start off actually with Tim Stout. I thought it would be helpful to start off with kind of a story of one landowner who has engaged in the program. And so Tim will spend a few minutes talking a little bit about his experience. And Tim, you are, I think, almost through the process of enrolling in the Family Forest Carbon Program. Maybe not quite 100% there, but pretty darn close. So Tim will start off just sharing a little bit about himself, more about his interests, but also sharing a little bit about the process by which he and his family have gone through to enroll in the program. And then I actually have a sort of I always like to kind of kick off the panel discussion. I think it's helpful to sort of warm up the conversation. So I have some questions that I think we didn't really get a chance to get to last time. And so I have some kind of prepared questions for the panel. And then I'm hoping to turn it over to you guys. Like I said, the goal of tonight really is to make this a conversation. And for you folks, for you who are on the call tonight, to be able to ask questions, share thoughts, and speak directly to these folks. So we are a small group again, so feel free to add your questions to the chat box. But when we get to that kind of live Q&A session, if everybody on the panel is comfortable with it, I welcome folks to turn on your video. And if you'd like to ask your question in person, you're welcome to do so. So with that, let's turn things over to Tim, and Tim's going to share a little bit about his experience as a landowner enrolling in the Family Forest Carbon Program.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Welcome all. And it's a privilege to be on the call. I'm very, very focused on looking at forest carbon sequestration and storage and incorporating that on our farm down in Shrewsbury, Vermont, incorporating that into our land management strategies. So I'll dip into a brief presentation shortly, but I am not a forester. I don't have the qualifications that other people on this call have, but I've managed this farm for about 50 years and managed a large area of private land down in Wayland, Massachusetts, before we moved up to Vermont. So I know a lot about land stewardship and have been a part of the current use program since its inception. So I will see if I can share my presentation here. So as Kate implied, I've been working with the American Forest Foundation since the inception of discussions about rolling a program out in northern New England. So for about 3 years now, and my focus has been on what role can I as a landowner play in bringing this concept to other landowners. So what's it going to take to entice other landowners to envision how this would fit into their land management plans? So it's been a great venture. I run an organization out of Jockey Hill Farm, my farm down in Shrewsbury, which with a goal or an entity called Northam Forest Carbon. We bring about 200 landowners through our property on an annual basis to talk about what we're doing on a broad basis, and then talk specifically about forest carbon. We participated in a pilot of the Family Forest Carbon Program back about 1.5 years ago. We're inches from signing the final contract for the core Family Forest Carbon Program. I have to give American Forest Foundation huge credit because when I received the first contract, I had a lot of questions from what I thought were a landowner's perspective. We went through all of those. The responses to those are included in the contract. So my goal is kind of bridge that gap between They're very technical to what we envision landowners being most attracted to. And it's been a great venture. My brother and I own this farm. His whole family is very much on board, as is my mother, who grew up at this farm. So we're quite excited about it. So where is Jockey Hill Farm? It's down right outside of Rutland, a little town called Shrewsbury with a population of about 680 people. Our approach to this farm, when I had my last land management plan created for the current use program, it was a pretty exhaustive plan, and I worked for months and months with our consulting forester and our county forester to come up with a plan that was pretty holistic. I wanted a chapter on forest carbon, or a placeholder on forest carbon, placeholder on climate change, on top of all the other material in that plan. So we're looking at all these different objectives on the land, some more mature than others, but we take it all the way from the biodiversity through to a succession plan for the land, to carbon sequestration and storage. And we're looking at how to tie that all together and present a story that landowners who visit our land can digest and in turn share their experiences. So this is the Stout Farm, is my farm up in the hills there. We have about 150 acres. My uncle used to own the Benio farm there. I manage that farm for the Benio family. So in total, we have 400 acres, which adjoins the Calvin Coolidge Forest, which has 23,000 acres on Calvin Coolidge West. So this is kind of out my back door. I'm an avid drone photographer, so I only take pictures of landscapes, not people and buildings. But you look at this and you think, what a glorious forest sink. And my family thinks I'm nuts to look at it that way. But to me, it's like, this is a constantly operating machine to sequester and store carbon. And this goes on for 24,000 acres. So it speaks very well to the goals of the Family Forest Carbon Program. My great-grandfather, who purchased the property for $1 from Middlebury College, took great pride in the land. We're now 6 generations living on it. So there's a long history of us managing that land. And my focus now is on the next 60 years. What is that going to look like? This is my grandson, who actually lives out in Los Angeles. That's why he's wearing a t-shirt and shorts and sitting on a beach. That's not Lake Champlain. But I love the thought of my grandson and granddaughter inheriting this land and knowing that it's protected. Maybe it'll be 20 years before they appreciate it, but that is protected, and that we've played an active role in climate mitigation and adaptation. This gives you a sense of some of the projects we have going on at the land. We're participating in the Family Forest Carbon Program. You'll see 2 bubbles floating in the middle of that picture. The background green, the larger green, is our maple stand. It's actually about a third larger than that. It's about 45 acres. The lighter green, the surface bubble, is where the pilot for the Family Forest Carbon Program took place. Now that was about 20 acres. No, 40 acres. We've expanded that to about 80 acres, 80 to 90 acres out of our 175. This is what our old house looked like. It was burned down in the early 70s. We've rebuilt a tiny cottage there. This is a little history of the land, of the fellow who managed the land before I took it over. And he managed it for a good 60 years, and a man of many talents, as you can see here with his fiddle and in his forge. And This is him haying the field in front of our house, them tapping these trees, and we still tap all these trees by now with tubing, but we can still identify. These pictures were taken back in the 40s. We can still identify where those trees are. You know, a lot of them are pretty hollow, but they're still producing sap. So this is my attempt at a diagram to tie it all together and where forest carbon fits into our broader objectives. And I imagine that Sierra and Jim and Keith and Kate may have suggestions on how to refine this, but the intent at this stage is to show that these are the objectives we're looking at. And we're working with many of Keith's staff. We've gotten great input from Jim, generally from Fish and Wildlife, many people from Forest Parks and Recreation, many different organizations in Vermont. But I started out with a heavy focus on carbon, realizing that you can't just talk about carbon in isolation. You need to tie it into these other objectives and decide, all right, what are the priorities? And that's why when you saw the map before, we're not covering with the Family Forest Carbon Program, we're not covering our entire property. We're covering about, at this stage, about half of that. And if there are questions about that, Sierra and I can get into more detail. We do a lot of field trips at the property. This is a field trip or a day-long session at the farm where we're talking about carbon sequestration, climate change. In the foreground here, we have Tony D'Amato from UVM. So we bring a lot of people in to discuss these issues. This is what we did under the pilot program, the Family Forest Carbon Program, where we did some thinning of the understory to open up the understory, open up the canopy, to bring in, allow those beautiful larger trees to store more carbon, and then to bring in a fresh crop of trees that sequester more carbon. So we're looking at the storage with the older trees, we're looking at the younger trees for the sequestration. Here's the canopy, and trying to open it up as much as we can without taking some of our prime trees down. Of all the materials on forest carbon that I've looked at over the last 4 years, this is one that was done by Tony D'Amato at UVM and Paul Catanzaro at UMass. It's a wonderful primer on forest carbon, which I suspect Jim and Sierra discussed a lot of this in their session back in February with BWA. We do, through my organization, Northern Forest Carbon, we do various deliverables. We did one on forest carbon poster for landowners, which we've distributed about 400 of those across mostly Vermont, but Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. One of the fun things we did last summer was branch out and do planting of climate resilient trees with Tony D'Amato. This is my effort to bring in more family into what we're doing. We've had Ali Katsiba down, the Vermont County Forest or climate forester, who now is over at UVM Extension. Many of you may know Farm and Wilderness. That's one of our neighbors, so we work closely with them. This is a list of all the people who have contributed, and I probably left off a number of people there, but what's been fun is the level of support we've received. Finally, I'll finish up with a YouTube video that the American Forest Foundation just released on the Family Forest Carbon Program and Jockey Hill Farm, which you can find here. So I'll leave it at that. We're excited, very excited about the program. Again, I said I looked at a number of different programs, and for a host of reasons, chose to proceed with this one. Thanks, Kate.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. And super cool to see all the different ways that you're thinking about and integrating, forest management and thinking about carbon into the work that you're doing on your property. So thanks so much for sharing. Well, I thought let's kick off the panel conversation. And I was going to mention too, I put in the chat box a link to your website. As Tim shared, there are so many great resources that are available off of your website, including some posters and flow charts that I think folks might be interested in. So I put that link in the chat box. But let's bring it back to the panel conversation. And I thought we would start off the conversation this evening by kind of regrounding us in the Forest Carbon Program, recognizing that it's been a little while since most of us have had our heads in this and that we've convened around this. And so, Sierra, I was hoping that you could just sort of reorient us to give us a real brief overview of the program and also the eligibility requirements.
Yep, great. So currently we've got 2 practices for the Northeast. And the geographic regions for the Northeast currently is all of Vermont and 5 counties in Western Massachusetts. And as of this week, we are open to the entirety of New York State. So it's been a pretty busy week for me. So you guys in Vermont, all counties are open, and the 2 practices are both the level of eligibility is the same for both of them. It's just in terms of if you want to defer a harvest for 20 years, you go the route of grow older forests. If you do want the management flexibility to have a small timber harvest in that 20 years, you go the route of enhance your woodlands. So for basic eligibility, we're looking at private landowners with at least 30 acres of forested land in the eligible geographies. The forests need to originate from natural regeneration, so no plantations. And then there needs to be no restrictions on the land that exclude timber harvest activity. So like local ordinances, easements, conservation easements are applicable as long as there's no stringent requirements or restrictions rather regarding timber harvesting. And then we're also looking at predominantly hardwood forests. So the woodlands need to have at least 50% in stocking in the maple beech birch forest type. So we need those indicator species. And the stands need to be fairly well stocked. So beeline level stocking needs to have a certain amount of saw timber. It needs to have a certain maturity level. And things like that. So that's about the basic stand level eligibility. I think I covered it all.
Great. Thanks, Sierra. So let's hear it. Tim, anything, I guess thinking about, your experience going through the program, right, from start to where you're at, in terms of thinking about the eligibility or sort of, kind of the getting started part of the process. And I apologize, my family just got home. So you'll probably hear my kids in the background. Anyways, going back to kind of just, sort of the process for getting started in the program, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about kind of the process that you went through to get started. Did you start with your consulting forester, or did you reach out directly to the program?
So I reached, well, it was Vermont Land Trust and Nature Conservancy invited me to participate in early discussions. And then I stayed very closely involved throughout the construction of the program. And so I was always looking at it from a landowner perspective. All right, if I can understand it, then other landowners can understand it likely. And it's the program has evolved considerably over the last year. What I really appreciated about it is that, of course, one of the big issues around sequestration and storage is, are we really making a difference? Is there additionality? And it comes back to that. We have other issues like leakage and so forth, but I wanted to be comfortable that there was added value to the program. And I have to AFF's credit, they have some fantastic scientists working on it to verify that. So I wanted to, one, before I involved our family, feel comfortable that it was going to make a difference from a climate change perspective. And then the process of signing up, how complex is the contract? Does it give you all the information you need as a landowner? And I think the contract, I've worked with them on the last 4 months, is very, very well constructed. So I think the program has a lot of integrity. They've staffed up considerably with people like Sierra and several others who are involved in New England. So there are resources you can just call and get more input on.
Great, thanks. I'm so glad you mentioned the verification, Tim. And Jim, I'd ask you, maybe would you be willing to sort of chime in on kind of the overview of how this all works, right? To give us kind of the background on sort of the verification and the kind of process by which the Nature Conservancy and American Forest Foundation work to verify credits and sort of manage that process on the back end. I guess I don't know much about it. My background is in forestry, right? And so I'm curious. Can you just share a little bit more about kind of how that all works, what that process looks like, and what you guys do to verify that additionality and stuff?
Yeah, and so I'm so glad Tim called out the really important principle of additionality in carbon programs, that we are using this marketplace to drive change across landscapes, so that our forests are storing more carbon over what would have been common practice. So the way that this program works, that's a little different than other carbon programs that you may have heard about, is that we're using carbon revenue to cover the expenses that are given, the money that's given to the landowners through this contract to implement practices that we have evaluated. Tim was part of a multi-stakeholder process to really take a bunch of different practices and sort of narrow that down to the ones that we think were the most likely to add carbon over time on these landscapes over a 20-year period, because we want to be able to generate credits that could then help pay for more practices across the landscape. So the way that we do that basically is, when Tim's property is enrolled, he'll have some monitoring plots set out on his property, and they could be randomly selected in any one year to assess how his trees are growing as he's implementing these practices. Then Tim's property is matched to roughly 10 other properties that are in the Forest Service's FIA data. This is the Forest Inventory and Assessment Analysis Program, that is all across the country. It's on private, public, land. And so we match those up with properties that are very similar to Tim's in this case. So we'll look for to have the same forest type or in the same region, stand age, things like that. So there's roughly about 14 variables that we match up. And then we track Tim's growth on his land with those over time. And as Tim's trees respond to those treatments that he puts in place, and we watch how other landowners that are not enrolled in the program manage their trees on these FIA plots. And we see the difference between those two. And hopefully, as Tim's practices store and they sequester more carbon along the way, that all adds up, and there's that difference between those two is what starts to get calculated. And so there's a random sample of properties throughout the landscape, and those are aggregated together in each reporting period, and that's applied across the board. So those credits are generated. The credits get sold in the voluntary market by the Nature Conservancy and the American Forest Foundation, and that revenue is then paying back some of the early investors in this program to get it going. But what it all comes down to is that that money is coming in to help you all cover those practices, which in many cases may be like thinnings, and Sierra can get into sort of the specifics of it, but because sometimes those practices don't really generally pay for themselves, it's a little bump up to sort of help that management happen and our forests improved over time.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Well, speaking of practices, Barbara had a question in the chat box, and I think I'd like to kind of shift the conversation anyway to talking a little bit about the use value appraisal program, also known as current use. Keith, you've been quiet. We haven't really brought you into the conversation, so I'd love to turn things over to you for a second and just have you talk a little bit about kind of the intersection between the Family Forest Carbon Program and UVA, and sort of how those two programs interact and what that might look like for a landowner.
Sure. I think to start out, I'll give a little bit of context for UVA. UVA, Use Value Appraisal, is the program that landowners can enroll in, enroll their forest land in if they're committing to managing that for saw timber and other compatible values. There are about 16,000 parcels enrolled in the state, about 2 million forest land acres. It's been around for about 40 years, and a lot of folks feel like it's one of the most successful conservation programs in the state. And more than that, it's really compatible with a lot of other management approaches and ways that landowners engage with other support systems, whether it be NRCS funding or getting conservation easements or so on. And in all of these programs these carbon, this practice program is no different. They really operate independently of each other, but where they're compatible, they're compatible. And so when considering, is my property compatible with engagement with this program, these practices, the question is, can my property be managed in the way that's required by the program? And most land enrolled in the program needs to be managed for saw timber. And in order to do that, you got to maintain a management plan, updated every 10 years, and continuously be able to act on that requirement to manage for saw timber. And you kind of re-up and consider where the current status is at each 10-year cycle, and take steps. And for some periods, that's allowing it to grow. And at other times, that's doing management that sustainably harvests some saw timber and supports growth of more. And so there are some elements of this program that are consistently compatible, and that's not by accident. There's been a lot of work between Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation and TNC and AFF on ensuring that there is some compatibility in important areas between these two programs, and recognizing that there are some areas where the compatibility isn't as universal, but can exist, and I'll share, it may increasingly exist on some properties. So I'll give some common examples. So productive forest land, the most common enrollment category in the UVA program, needs to be managed for saw timber. And so when that is being enrolled, landowners are taking advantage of the Enhance Your Woodland practice, which allows for some active management to advance various objectives, including saw timber objectives. There are limits to cutting, but those are also compatible with the productive forest land category. If productive forest land is enrolled and the landowner is considering growing older forests, it is likely not going to be compatible, because that means that a landowner is committing to not managing their forest for that time period. And that's something that we've been on the same page about with AFF and TNC about since early on. However, there are portions of properties, ecologically significant treatment areas, where saw timber management is not required. And those areas would be compatible with growing older forests and potentially with enhancer woodlands if the practices employed there are consistent with the requirements of the ecologically significant treatment areas. I think on some properties in the coming year, there will be more land that will be compatible with the growing older forest. There's a new enrollment subcategory that's going into effect on July 1. It's called reserve forest land, in which land enrolled in this subcategory, if a parcel is eligible, and about 15% of parcels in the state are likely to be eligible, then those parcels need to be managed, when enrolled in this category, need to be managed for old forest values and functions. And at times, passive management is a really appropriate management strategy for that condition. And in which case, if the parcel is eligible and the land is enrolled in that category, then it would likely be compatible with the growing older forests practice. So there are those options. I think it's really important for landowners to know how their land is enrolled in the enrollment in UVA, and what the management requirements are, and then also consider what the requirements of the practices are for this program, and where there's compatibility between the requirements, then a landowner can engage in both. If they're not compatible, then a landowner may be in a position to need to choose one or the other, and go from there.
Great, thanks, Keith. So there actually was a question from Marianne in the chat box today. Before we move too far away from the current use in UVA program, just can you talk a little bit about, the question was about, does the program result in lower property taxes? And so can you just remind folks kind of how the current use UVA program works in terms of reduction in property taxes?
Sure. So I think that the financial parts of the current use program are very different than the AFF and TNC's family forest carbon programs, but current use reduces taxes for landowners who are enrolled by, once enrolled, the land will be assessed at the use value of that property. And so the use value is the value that somebody might pay for land that is only being managed for saw timber based on its revenue generating potential. Long story short, it's something like $180 an acre. It changes, it gets reassessed every year. I can give that number. Generally, folks can expect, on average, a tax savings of about 90% on enrolled land. And it really depends if land is extremely valuable or less valuable. Enrollment savings that landowners realize will vary based on that.
Great, thanks for sharing. And of course, the relationship between UVA and AFF and the Family Forest Carbon Program is different, as you said, in terms of the incentives and the financial aspects. Louis, looks like you've turned your camera on, and I know you had a question in the chat. I'd love to. Would you like to ask your question of the panelists yourself?
Well, sure. So in the earlier discussion, they talked about the baseline. You're constantly comparing, the enrolled properties with other similar properties spread around the United States. Personally, being from the Northeast, it's hard to imagine stuff in the Northwest being similar, but not arguing about that. One of my questions, USDA, particularly in their EQIP program, just announced a program last fall. So this is supposedly all of or most of the eastern United States. They're supposedly going to spend like tens of millions of dollars promoting carbon sequestration. And my question is, because that's got such a huge reach through EQIP, isn't that going to skew the baseline you guys are working from?
Yeah, I'll take that. Louis, excellent question. And the short answer is yes. And I just want to clarify an earlier statement that I made. We are comparing like properties in this region. So Tim's property would not be compared to somebody out in the Pacific Northwest. It would be compared with other northern hardwood sites within the Northeast region. So we're trying to be as much apples to apples as possible. So, but yeah, your question really gets to the fundamental sort of principle of this baseline, is that it's a dynamic baseline. And if for whatever reason, be it EQIP or a societal shift in how we harvest trees happens, and we're comparing that, then that would result in a smaller number of credits being issued because that comparison to common practice would be different. And so we feel like that's really what's nice about this approach, is that it really does show additionality, and it also exemplifies the risk that the American Forest Foundation and TNC have been taking in developing this program, because we're doing some speculation here, as well as some of our philanthropic donors and others, that there is a chance that the practices don't pencil out or don't show up the way we think they're penciling out. And so, and we're taking on that risk, as opposed to you, the landowner, taking that risk on. So I think your observation is a very astute one, and one that we've been, trying to factor in as much as we can to our planning.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Louis. Excellent question. And I'll take this opportunity just to remind folks, again, if you have a question, please feel free to pop it in the chat, or like Louis did, please feel free to just turn your camera on. We're a small group, and, we really hope that tonight is a conversation, back and forth. So welcome, these great questions. Keep them coming. Keith, just to bring us back, we talked a little bit about practices. I guess, is it safe to say that, sort of this conversation, I guess there's a question in the chat from Barbara about kind of, who makes the final decision? And as you were talking, it struck me that, this process really involves a conversation, right? A conversation between the landowner, the consulting forester, and I would imagine AFF. And I'd love for you guys just to talk for a minute about kind of what that process might look like, and sort of, where do you start in that conversation, and maybe, sort of who makes the final decision about these questions around compatibility and landowner objectives and goals, and that type of thing.
Sure. And I think I can speak only for current use, and Sierra or Jim can speak for family forest carbon, but this is true for a lot of the programs that landowners navigate, that these programs are administered by independent organizations who care very much about the program, believe deeply in the program they're administering, and also care very much about the compatibility and interaction between various programs that landowners can benefit from. And so in each individual case, for current use, the county forester and Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation and Property Valuation and Review, who are always responsible for administering the current use, will have the final say on whether or not the management plan and the current status of that land remains eligible. And that is going to be the bottom line for each property. With that said, there has been a lot of work up front to ensure that the practice requirements and the conversations that we have and the relationships we have really minimize any confusion about under what circumstances an an incompatibility may occur. And it's really our work and the staff who are administering family forest carbon to be aware of those potential conflicts and flag those. And this is all supported by a well-informed landowner who's asking questions and knows their responsibilities for each of the programs that they're considering. Ultimately, they're responsible, and ideally is working with a consulting forester who is looking out for the intersection of those of the various interests, because we can add conservation easements to the mix. We can add NRCS and EQIP or CSP practices to the mix, and the list goes on. And so right now we're actually talking about a very simple interaction, and in reality there's a lot more players at the table than we have in this conversation. And so there's a little bit of faith, a little bit of trust, but there's a lot of work that is going into evaluating each individual case, but also really working on compatibility among programs at the larger scale.
Keith, or if I can add to that, Keith, I think when I started out in this about 4 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of knowledge among the foresters I was working with on forest carbon sequestration and storage. In that, I mean, all the foresters certainly knew about carbon sequestration and storage, but there's some skepticism about that additionality issue. And rightly so. Certainly my consulting forester, Alan Calfee, Calfee Woodland Management, and Mike White, they had lots of questions. I think there's been a lot of training, and Keith, you know this far better than I do, but a lot of training of foresters, county foresters, consulting foresters on this topic, which to me as a landowner has been extremely helpful. So it's, initially I was kind of pushing the agenda. Now, there's much more expertise in the area, and it is a big lift. It's taken me, I was at the very start, but it's been a huge lift to AFF's credit. The way they present it, the way that the knowledge among the parties that are involved, it's grown significantly. So I think, people look at the contract I have, and there's a lot there. It's 48 pages long, but it is pretty digestible, and the program isn't a big lift. Understanding it thoroughly is a challenge, but all parties involved, in my view, have made great strides in simplifying it for landowners. And that's only because landowners have so many other objectives, so many other things they're dealing with, that it's a lot to deal with.
May I ask?
Great. Oh, sorry.
Barbara, let's just have Sierra. I'd love for Sierra to chime in, and then Barbara, will turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Keith and Tim, for the great explanation. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of good communication, and making sure that everyone has the knowledge and the ability to communicate and, know the requirements of each of the practices and of, the given state's current use program. Because I am also working in many states in the Northeast, and they all have their different programs. So, just making sure that channel is open between the different programs is really important.
Great. Thanks, Sierra. Barbara, would you like to share your question?
Yes. If a harvest is indicated for carbon sequestration purposes, and I know that rare endangered birds are nesting in that particular selected area, how does one proceed? That is, if I'm equally committed to bird habitat and forest sequestration, how does that competition line up? How does that work? And also, I think current use has begun to encourage habitat as a purpose accepted or perhaps encouraged under current use. That may be wrong.
I take a run at this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Barbara, that is an awesome question, and I think it really encapsulates. I mean, Tim showed the kind of breadth of values that he's managing for. And there's one thing that folks often say about forest management: it's not rocket science. It's much more complex than that. But navigating that compatibility is really important. When we're talking about endangered species habitat, that comes first. And it is often compatible, but the management is often compatible, not always. And so the question is, what's the bird? When's it going to be there? What is it? What creates threats to it? Are there ways to do this while not creating those risks of a take or stressing that bird out? If the answer is no, then that may be a place to really just say, this is a place to be considering what other things I might do with this land that support that habitat and also provide me value, whatever economic, social, whatever that value might be. I say that while also coming back to active forest management is frequently compatible with a lot of endangered species habitats, and in fact may be extremely valuable to supporting habitat. So I think the specifics really matter. When it comes to use value appraisal, if there is an endangered species present, there may be enrollment categories that a landowner can take advantage of, like an ecologically significant treatment area, that don't require active management because the conservation value of endangered species habitat is celebrated, and the program does allow for management under certain conditions for that species, potentially to the exclusion of timber management. And those really are only applied in limited cases, but they do exist, and depending on the specifics, property might be eligible. With that said, I think that question about is a management activity for carbon storage or sequestration indicated, and is it appropriate? I think that there are a lot of great ways to approach forest management, and some management may support long-term carbon storage. Some approaches may support carbon sequestration, a different function in the future. Some approaches may not maximize carbon storage or sequestration, but may be really important for the ability of that forest to adapt to climate change, which may be another really important value to be managing for. And so that's the work that I think Tim was referring to, that there's a lot of tension between these various goals. It's one of the reasons I also love forestry, is because there are so many amazing things we depend on from our forests. We're all surrounded by wood, and yet we're here talking about carbon and endangered species habitat and all that. So we depend on all of it. And so we need to find the right balance between all of those really important things. And I think it's compatible, and there's a way to have a good balance among them.
Very quickly, if I have enough acreage, I could say, yes, I will do a harvest. I'm due to do a harvest, but let's do it over here instead of there. Is that the kind of thing that what kind of flexibility one might have?
Potentially, and I can't speak in the hypotheticals. It really depends on what's happening on the ground. The management land that's enrolled in the current use program needs to be managed for saw timber, and if there is a concern about endangered species habitat, and there should be, if it's present and we cannot mitigate for it, then it should be eligible as an ecologically significant treatment area. But that is at the determination of the county forester and Fish and Wildlife Department. And so the specifics of that, I think, are really can be navigated with the consulting forester and with the county forester and the Fish and Wildlife Department, in considering what are the options here. And I think that you can get some really great clarity about what those would be.
And Keith, and
Great.
I'm sorry, Barbara, did I cut you off? Keith, a quick follow-up to your comment. What has been so rewarding about pursuing this in Vermont is the quality of the professionals. And this isn't to pump you guys all up, but the quality of the professionals in forestry across the state. So I've learned so much from, all of you have been incredibly generous, but it's fairly easy to track down answers to questions, and people I've found have been the professionals and Forest Parks and Recreation, Fish and Wildlife, UVM, Nature Conservancy, VLT, et cetera, on and on and on, many listed on the list of credits I gave in my presentation. The expertise that's out there that we as landowners have access to is quite remarkable. And I've done a lot of work in Massachusetts and in Colorado, and I wasn't quite as involved as I've been here in Vermont, but it's been very rewarding and exciting, and that's why I think forest carbon has such a future here.
Great, thanks, Tim. So I just maybe kind of as a sort of wrap up question, Knox has a question in the chat, and I'd love to just get your thoughts maybe on sort of, recognizing sort of that the Family Forest Carbon Program has evolved so much, right, since its startup. And so Knox is just asking what changes do you expect are kind of in the wind for the future of the program? And I know, specifically he was wondering about the pine trees being more valued for their sequestration moving forward. But I would just love, from Jim and Sierra, maybe just some thoughts on kind of what can we expect to see in the future, or what changes do you expect as the program continues to evolve?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, these two practices are only compatible with hardwood stand types, but we and that's Maple Beech birch forest type specifically. I can announce that very shortly we're going to have an oak hickory forest type. The practice will still be the same. There'll be just a couple of different eligibility requirements for the oak hickory forest type. But you could either enroll in grow older forest or enhance your woodlands for oak hickory. So that's coming very, very soon. And then further down, we are still working on possible methodologies for softwood forest types, which includes spruce fir, most importantly, and then also like a pine type forest type as well. So those are still in the works with our science team. So Jim, I don't know if you want to add anything more, but those are coming. We are working on them.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I would add, Sierra, is that this pilot started in Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, and Eastern New York, and we are moving forward with. We will be expanding the geography into New Hampshire and Maine in the coming year, keeping our fingers crossed. So we're putting the planning in place to do that. So I noticed there was at least one person on was that you, Louis? Yeah, from New Hampshire. So keep your ears open. We're hoping to be expanding fairly soon to that.
It's
So,
fine.
and that would bring in, hopefully also start bringing in some other forest types as we do that expansion.
Great. Thanks so much. And, I guess I think that's it for the questions in the chat box. I'd love just to wrap up the conversation today. I think we covered a lot of ground and appreciate both everybody's, questions and thoughtfulness of the conversation tonight, and also the participation of our panelists. I'd love just one quick kind of round robin. Any advice that you as panelists have for forest landowners who are considering participating in a carbon program, such as the Family Forest Carbon Program? Any kind of parting words of wisdom or advice for other landowners who are considering engaging in this type of program? Or maybe one piece of advice. I know I know we're at time and we could probably go like much longer with a whole bunch, of different pieces of advice. So let's wrap it up with one last, piece of advice for landowners.
I guess I'll put a pitch in for Family Forest Carbon, familyforestcarbon.org. I'm going to pop that in the chat, but if you check that site out, it's a great, easy first step to find your property, see if it's eligible, and then start to get in contact with the call agents at AFF, and then hopefully have Sierra show up at your door after that, and or one of the other foresters. So that's my big plug for a good next step. And then also the Nature Conservancy has a climate forestry guide as well. And if you Google that, Climate Smart Forest NE, you'll find a nice resource there for other things to be thinking about for your woodlands.
Yeah, I will second that what Jim said. If you go onto the website, and it's free to apply. It's free to just look up your woodland. You get a report that's emailed to you. And just connecting with the call agents and the account managers is also free. So, it doesn't hurt you to just talk to some other qualified individuals if you have more questions.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Tim?
I'd second what Jim and Sierra shared, saying that the staff at AFF are extremely available and accessible in terms of their knowledge of the program and willingness to talk about it and provide guidance. One other resource I'd strongly recommend is a website called Securing Northeast Forest Carbon, which was created by Charlie Levesque, Ali Kasiba, a number of other people, but the resources has become kind of a go-to resource for me on forest carbon.
Great. Thanks, Tim, for mentioning that. And I believe, Keith, you had put a link to that in the chat box. So thank you so much for doing that.
I just dropped it again, and it's perfect because I think the Family Forest Carbon Program has done a lot of work to thread the needle in a hard place to thread the needle. And yet it's also really new. And a lot of these other carbon programs are really new, and things are changing extremely fast. And you cannot engage in these without a long-term commitment. I mean, it's shorter term in some programs, but it's still a long-term commitment. And so I think it's really important that landowners, as exciting as taking care of your forests and helping do your part with climate change and getting some financial benefits in the process, as exciting as all of that is, it's really important to be informed and go slow and patiently. And so using all your resources to find out what the options are, find out what the risks are, talk to your consulting forester, talk to your county forester, ask questions of AFF and TNC and others about how the program works for your property and how things change. And when you know it's right, that's great. But just make sure you're informed. Do your homework.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And Keith, just to kind of wrap up on that note in terms of being informed, again, I appreciate all the panelists for joining us tonight, and for all of you participating, asking questions, and engaging in this conversation. I did want to share that, like these webinars that we've been offering, all of us, all of our partners, Tim mentioned all the different professionals, that are here available to help. But we also, I think, here in Vermont, are really fortunate to have a whole bunch of different nonprofit organizations that are, sort of here available to help support, but also provide education. And this, I think, program tonight is a great example of when we all come together to share and to coordinate and to collaborate to bring you guys as landowners or land managers all the latest updated kind of information for you to make informed decisions. And so on that note, as a collaborative, we expect that each of our organizations will probably over the next 6 months be hosting a whole bunch of different in-person walks in the woods, opportunities for folks to get out in the woods, continue to ask these questions. I know Tim has offered up his property, and I expect that we'll be offering a walk down there at some point, either this spring or this summer. And so there'll be lots more opportunities, I guess, is partly, my message here for us over the coming years to engage in education and to get out into the woods and really, continue these conversations, learn about the programs, learn about the experiences of different landowners, and again, be able to kind of continue to ask these questions. So be on the lookout for that. My hope is, as those programs get planned, those of you who are signed up and a part of the webinar tonight and were a part of the webinar back in February, will continue to communicate those opportunities out through that email list. So with that, again, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jim and Sierra and Tim and Keith, for taking the time to join us tonight. I think, I think it was a really rich conversation, and I look forward to continuing it. As we know, these programs continue to evolve. Our management of our forests continues to evolve, and it's important to keep these conversations going and keep the learning coming. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight, and appreciate our panelists for taking the time to share their knowledge and experience.
Thanks for
Thank you.
having us.
Thanks all.